Okay, I think we're gonna start and get going here today. We want to keep everybody on time. So the first thing I'm going to ask is that everybody mute themselves. I think given that we're expecting about 200 people today, we'll use the chat to communicate, and please feel free to talk to each other and to talk to us, and we'll try and monitor the chat between me and Michelle and Andrea. So as we're getting ready for the conference this morning, well, this past week, I was thinking about last year and how much has happened in this past year. And at this time last year, I think we were all flying by the seat of our pants. I know Andrea and I certainly felt that we were when we were planning and moving the conference from what we thought was going to be in person to remote, to a Zoom conference. And at this time, many of us were actually thinking we might even be back on campus for graduation at the end of the 1920 school year. There was no vaccine. We were in the middle of a presidential election. George Floyd was alive. We didn't even know about taking temperatures and thermometers. I mean, it went from, really mundane details to really huge world-changing events. So this has been quite a year, and I know that we are coming out of this year having done a lot of things none of us ever expected that we would have to do, or we are now experts in things we never thought we'd have to know anything about. Last year at this time, our listserv was dominated by PPP, work from home questions, concerns about enrollment, the need for additional financial assistance, reimbursement for phone and internet, temperature scanners, disinfectant foggers, and PPE. In the interim, we become experts in testing, ventilation, OWL cameras, and contact tracing. It's been a year of evolving circumstances and changing guidance, and we've been responsible for areas beyond our wildest imaginations. Our schools operate within the larger community. We are not isolated. Local, state, national, and international, it all influences us, and we are a part of it. And this year made that very clear. Through it all, you've relied on each other, your California colleagues, for answers and support. And you've also relied on our trusted corporate resources. Thank you to all of our sponsors who support Cal-ISBOA year after year and who support our schools day in and day out throughout the years, and never more than this past year. Thank you also to our planning committee who have come together to plan this conference throughout what has been a really demanding year for everyone. I just want to take a moment and acknowledge the committee. Jane Davis from the Archer School for Girls is the conference chair. Steve Bajik from the Chinese American International School. Stephen Lawrence from Berkwood Hedge. Natalie Morales from the Chandler School. Jerry Mullaney from Head Royce. Sandy Pierce at Kate. Dan Rothbauer from Curtis School. And of course, thank you to Michelle Shanks, who's come on board to help during this time. And as always, thank you to Andrea Marcus, without whom none of this would get done. She certainly makes my life much easier and much more pleasant. And together we try and have a good time while putting things together. This year, we've also learned the pluses and minuses of remote work as well as Zoom. And because of that, I'm going to keep my remarks brief and focus on what's important today, which is coming together to share information. We will offer an update of the association on May 21st at our annual meeting, which is scheduled from 9 to 10 that day. That's a time change, and we do hope that you will join us for that. And so, sorry, Zoom difficulties. Without further ado, I want to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Ari Betof. And Ari, who many of you may recognize from the presentations that we've had this past year in conjunction with SAIS and about 33 other associations. He's been a facilitator on webinars and a panelist for independent schools on the brink. Ari has a deep background in independent schools. He is the co-founder of Mission and Data, a firm dedicated to the effectiveness, health, and vitality of independent schools and other organizations that make the world a better place. He's a nationally recognized expert in the area of independent school organizational stewardship and financial sustainability. He's also the Chief Advancement Officer at Minerva Institute for Research and Scholarship based in San Francisco. He's been an independent school trustee, head of school, director of institutional advancement, and director of enrollment management. He began his career as a physics and mathematics teacher, coach, and dorm parent. He served as an instructor in the University of Pennsylvania's Penn GSE mid-career doctoral program in educational leadership. And he's also served as a mentor in Harvard University's School Leadership Program and faculty member in the NAIS School Leadership Institution. And without further ado, I would like to present Dr. Ari Betof. Ari?
Good morning. It's always weird in Zoom land to say that and then hear absolutely nothing back, right? But we're all used to that now. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if I can. So thank you. I hope everybody is having a wonderful morning. I'm so glad to be with you all here today. What we're going to do for about the next half hour or so is we're going to talk about reset without retreat. And I'm going to pause this just for a second here so I can move this so you can see it. There we go. Reset without retreat. And we know, as hard as everyone has worked, we're coming up to the end of what has been a important, difficult, a fascinating year, if not an exhausting year. And at the same time, we know that we already need to be looking ahead and have been looking ahead in many ways for a number of months to the next year that is ahead of us. The CEO of Blue Apron had this wonderful quote on a podcast I was listening to a few weeks ago, which is, "The pandemic is not a business model." And I love that statement. It's such a wonderful and true idea. We've been reacting now for over a year in pandemic times. But the truth of the matter is that the pandemic is not a plan. And that's a really important thing for us to keep track of moving forward. This is a slide I use in a number of different ways in different presentations, but I think it's particularly true for the moment that we're in right now. There are a group of people who I think believe falsely that if we just stay the course and get to next fall, everything will be the same as it always was. And the truth is that there is really no data to suggest that that is true. That next year may be more familiar to us, but our world has fundamentally changed. And whether we call it the new normal or the next new normal or something else, I think we know that next year is going to be different than it is now. And it may be a little bit more familiar, but it is going to be fundamentally different than the past. Some of that will be good. Some of that will be less good. And I want to talk particularly about the lens that I bring to this work. As you might expect from someone who helped co-found a firm called Mission and Data, I fundamentally believe in a particular lens for thinking about decision making, big decisions and small decisions. So I believe that independent schools should fundamentally be mission driven and community centered and data informed. In our world, we talk a lot about data-driven decision-making. But the truth is, I don't think any of us really want our schools to be driven by data. That is not who our schools are. Our schools, at their core, exist to live their mission, right? I don't think many of you come to work each day going, God, I'm here because I want to be driven by the data that's in front of me, right? And so you are committed, I hope, and your schools are committed to the mission of your educational institution, to educating students now and into the future, to your 501c3 purpose, to the particular flavors sort of you bring to that, whether you're religiously affiliated, whether you're single sex, whether you're Montessori, or whether you have a particular other approach that you bring to your particular independent school. You're also community centered. And I think when we make our best decisions, we are taking in information from lots of different constructs, but we're making decisions that are right in the context of our individual school communities. And so something that may work well for one of my clients in Chicago may not be right for another client in the mountains outside of LA, or may not be right for a school in downtown San Francisco. Similarly, I do think we all recognize that we need to be better informed by data. We need to capture data in ways that are accurate and precise, and we need to use them in ways that help us live our mission. Last spring, I said on a number of the webinars that I was part of, I said to different communities, you're heading into a year with more unknowns, more variability, and more pressure than basically at any time in any of our professional lives. And I think by and large, that was true. I think if you disagree with me, feel free to tell me in the chat box. But I think most people have experienced the last year as a crush of lack of clarity at various points, a tremendous amount of variability away from norms, which didn't let us use historic data and context as well as we have in past years, and tremendous pressure. Sometimes real pressure related to school viability and families and employees being safe, sometimes perceived pressure. The challenge now is pulling forward, right? To identify those takeaways from this year that will really be lasting positive change in our school community without snapping back. That phrase "snapping back" is one I really like. I'm gonna, in this upcoming season, be a co-host with Hans Mundahl of the EMA Enrollment Spectrum podcast. And we've already started recording episodes for our upcoming season. One of our first sets of interviews was a few weeks ago, and it was with Jeff Shields from NBOA and with Heather Hurl from EMA, and they had a wonderful conversation together about this idea of pulling things forward that can make progress and not snapping back to old bad habits. And so I encourage you in later this spring when that episode comes out to take a listen to that as well. I'll certainly share that out with the community. So when we talk about reset without retreat, I really want to talk about this in a few areas. One is building momentum. Many schools are surprisingly in better shape this time this year than you were this time last year, or maybe even this time the year before. And the question is how to continue to build momentum. If you're not, how do you gain some momentum, gain some traction and momentum? And we'll talk about that. I want to talk about cultivating a vibrant school community, and we'll talk about this in a number of different ways. This complicated world that we're in right now about in person, on campus, remote, and virtual work, as well as really weaving important diversity, equity, and inclusion work into every bit of the school community, including in the business office functions. Maximizing organizational capacity and addressing exhaustion. We're not going to put up a poll today, but I've done this with other groups, and I sort of give people a range from refreshed and renewed to exhaustion, and as you might imagine, lots of the numbers fall over this way, right? And you started the year exhausted by and large because you had an incredibly difficult summer, right? And if you don't find a way to enter next year more refreshed, there are going to be long-term challenges and issues that come from that. And then striving toward financial sustainability. What I'm going to encourage you to do, we're not going to have a ton of time at the end of this session for questions, if any. I'm going to hopefully be able to take one or two through this Poll EV site. So you are welcome to add your questions here. You can upvote or downvote topics and other questions. If I have a couple minutes at the end of the presentation today, I'll try to pick one or two off. But we have a session, Martha, I believe it's at 4 o'clock Pacific time, where you all can rejoin me, and I'm happy to take questions or talk about topics more deeply with anyone who wants to, in addition to the other panels and things that are happening in between those two events. So again, I just put it into chat as well. That's at pollev.com. And you're welcome to add your questions there, and I'll get to one or two if I can at the end and address the majority of them later this afternoon. So let's go right to building momentum. I did my doctoral research, actually started my doctoral research 2 years before the start of the Great Recession. And I thought I was going to do a dissertation on the concept of organizational stewardship and servant leadership. And the more I got into it, I think the more we got into the context of the Great Recession, right? And we saw the market crash and and companies that were too big to fail. And all of a sudden, everything that involved organizational stewardship of independent schools became financial sustainability of independent schools. And so I ended up pivoting my research to look at financial and organizational sustainability of independent schools through the Great Recession. One of the lessons that we learned, both during and after the Great Recession, is that the vast majority of schools fell into one of three categories. There was a group of schools who came out of the Great Recession in a position of relative strength. Not that the recession didn't hurt, but they came out pretty healthy. And they have rode a wave of what is arguably one of the best decade-long economic periods in our country's history. And they entered the COVID-19 pandemic really pretty strong. Full enrollment, healthy campus, significant building, major fundraising, lots of endowment, right? Really, really strong positions. This self-perpetuating upward spiral. There is another group of schools who, by tremendous effort, made it through the Great Recession, but came out pretty wounded. And over the last decade, those schools have fought and scrapped, again, in many ways, through even more effort in some ways than the other schools, and have managed to stay alive. But they entered the pandemic really on thin ice. Now, PPP1, PPP2 have sort of created additional runway for a number of those schools, but they are really challenged by the same dynamic that we see in the higher ed space among small liberal arts colleges, which they are in this downward spiral that they need to try to get themselves out of. In the middle, if you imagine sort of a horizontal plane going across there, is what I think of as the muddy middle, right? And some schools are sort of stuck in that place. If any of you are basketball fans, they often related to the NBA draft talk about teams that sort of end up in this muddy middle in between. They never sort of get a high enough draft pick to kind of make a big leap forward, and yet they never are really awful either. They're just kind of stuck. There are a bunch of schools that are working so hard, right? But they're under-enrolled. They're not critically under-enrolled, but they're just always kind of stuck in quicksand. And I want you to think really honestly for yourself where your school falls, because where your school falls in this determines a lot about how you should respond over the next year. Because if you're in a downward spiral, your biggest challenge is to not die by 1,000 small paper cuts, right? If you're stuck in the muddy middle, you've got to figure out how to get yourself extricated, I'm going to mix metaphors now, from the quicksand and get yourself into an upward spiral. And if you're in an upward spiral, the opportunity is to really accelerate that over the next set of years. One way to do this, I love this image. Some of you may know Seth Godin. He's a prolific writer, often on marketing as well as other topics. He has this great idea about purple cows. And his point is purple cows stand out. It's like the easiest concept I've ever heard in my entire life to understand, which is purple cows are not boring. I want you to think again about your school And I want you to try to be really honest with yourself for a minute and ask yourself, do people in my school community think we are a purple cow? I'll give you a hint. The answer is yes. And are we really a purple cow? Many of you who are honest, the second one will be a whole lot harder to answer. There are lots of wonderful schools that are doing a great job educating students, that are living their mission, that are not particularly special. And that's really, really hard to hear. When I do this presentation or I include this in presentations or working sessions or facilitations with boards, with leadership teams, this is a topic we sometimes spend an entire morning just on this topic. Because until a school really understands if in its market, it is truly, truly special and unique, you can't really move forward, right? Because you don't know what you're trying to compete on. So many schools think they are special, but are not understood by the market as truly being a purple cow. And they are marketing themselves as if we just show people who we are, they will fall in love with us because we're so amazing. But the reality is the market doesn't see them that way. Even if you're doing tremendous things for your students and have been for years or decades. That difference between reality inside the school and perception is one that we're going to circle back to. Because the distance between reality and perception and misunderstandings within your community of reality and perception, not just about market positioning, not just about brand, but about who's working hard, who's allowed to be on campus, who's allowed to work remotely, who is struggling, who is not struggling, who is being advantaged by policies, who, right? All of these things, who's really leaning into diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice initiatives, who is not, right? All of these things about reality and perception layer onto your community, sometimes in ways that are helpful and often in ways that are not. And that's why I want to go back to the section on false optimism. The hardest thing in my work with leaders and boards of independent schools is that you all love your school community deeply. And that's not the hard part. The hard part is the end. And that leads you to be sometimes blinded to the very hard things that are directly in front of you. Not always, right? But our communities need truth tellers who can make the case for the reality of the school in ways that can be heard, right? We all know that there are people in our community who are speaking truth to power, right? And that's important. Doing it in a way that can be heard and understood is equally important. So that's the upward spiral, downward spiral, muddy middle context. Let's talk about cultivating a vibrant school culture. Many of your schools, especially in California, are at this moment of reuniting on campus together for the first time. Sometimes, obviously, still very distant. Later this week, I'm going to actually get onto an airplane, which I have not done in 15 months. I am curious if I remember how to do this. And I'm going to fly to Raleigh, Atlanta, and Dallas. So I'm jumping into the deep end of the pool with travel. And then I'm coming back home, and a couple of weeks later, I'm actually flying out to San Francisco to Minerva for our graduation out there. And all of these communities, of all of the clients who I'm working with, as well as Minerva Institute for Research and Scholarship, Minerva School is a KGI, we're one institution, are all thinking about how to bring our communities back together. And this is a really important topic. We're going to talk about this too in the panel that we have right after this discussion. As wonderful as that is, I want to, though, talk about the challenge, which is there is tremendous tension. People are really scared in some cases. And there are rifts forming among many, many, many individual employees, as well as groups of employees. I think many of you will be familiar with this challenge, right? That lots of schools have, where every academic department thinks they're the hardest working department in the school. And the science department says, but we have labs, and the English department says we have all this grading to do, right? And there's all that tension. But now we're laying on an even more complicated layer of tension on top of all of that, which is you have people remote, you have people in person, you have people who were remote and don't want to come back, you have people who are eager to come back and may not be allowed yet. And also people are just stressed and exhausted. It does, though, this moment of reuniting and resetting does give us an opportunity, to build some new norms. And I think one of those norms that we really have an opportunity to lean into even more authentically is truly weaving DEI into the fabric of our school communities. That doesn't just mean with programming. It doesn't just mean with students. It doesn't just mean in the curriculum. It means each of us in each of our roles having conversations and leaning into the work of DEI, saying what processes in the business office are helping or hindering these initiatives, right? In what ways are we being equitable? Equity, especially as it relates to the transition out of the pandemic, is going to be even more complicated than it's ever been before. We know that there is a spotlight, as there should be, on our racial justice work. We know that there's a spotlight, as there should be, on our access work. And there's also going to be a level of what I think of as productive complication related to everything having to do with how people work. And so I urge you to join the panel discussion that's right after this, where we're going to talk about the changing nature of work in independent schools. And we'll dive into that more. Maximizing organizational capacity and addressing exhaustion. Let's just go back to everybody's exhausted. Okay. Everybody's exhausted. I don't know a single person right now at a school, I don't know one actually, who does not feel exhausted. And that's really important to recognize. And there are several areas of the school where I'm particularly worried about this. The admission office is one of them, and the business office is another. That does not mean that those don't exist in other areas of the school, but I want to talk about the admission office and the business office in particular, one, because of the focus of your group, right? But also because those are the two groups who are most in danger of having basically an endless process with an inability to get off a treadmill. Fundraising offices, my wife is a major gift officer. I obviously am a chief advancement officer as well, in addition to our consulting practice at Minerva. There are ways in the advancement calendar to kind of catch your breath. It's hard work, right? It's intensive. As travel picks up, that will be a significant part. But for the business office and for the admission office, you're basically sprinting now from one fiscal year, one academic year into the next. Because schools by and large aren't full until right before schools open, if you're full at all, there's not this ability to both refresh and renew and to plan for the year ahead. Last year, most business offices did, 5, 6, 27, 35 versions of your budget, right? With weekly finance committee meetings in some cases. You've got to plan the time for your people to be able to bring their best selves to their work. Because if not, you're the equivalent of a marathon runner who's trying to sprint through your marathon. And we know that that doesn't work. More broadly, when I think about leveraging organizational capacity, and those of you that have seen me speak in other venues, this will seem very familiar to you. I think of leveraging organizational capacity in three big buckets. One is institutional capacity, one is programmatic capacity, and one is adaptive capacity. So institutional capacity is the money, the buildings, all the tangible stuff. Programmatic capacity is the capacity of your academic program, of your arts program, of your extracurricular programs, of your athletic program. Adaptive capacity is your school's ability to change and adapt. We know that basically every school is near the breaking point of adaptive capacity. You have changed so much, right? And that is why it's even more important to be conscious of that and be super savvy about what you choose to change and what you don't heading into this next year. Because the alternative is you will just fall back into old habits if you're not intentional. The thing that I suggest using as a sort of North Star for that is what's core about the school. And when I talk about what's core about the school, I'm thinking about what is immovable and essential. When I do significant engagements, year-long engagements with schools, we will often spend the good part of a morning just on this question of what's core, what's immovable and essential, to make sure that there's shared understanding between the board and the leadership team about what you are trying to steward as a leader or as a trustee of the institution. Because until you know that, it's hard to know how you can move all the other things around. So just within the business office, we can think about those critical functions, right? What things in the budget are absolutely essential? What things are not? And I'm not just talking about budget lines and GLs, right? I'm talking about what pieces of those budget lines. If you don't have a sense of that, it's hard to do a lot of that more advanced analysis and planning. Going back to this idea of being tired, lots of organizations, and this is absolutely appropriate, in times of strain and struggle, have to dig in, right? They pull on the resources, they pull on the reserves. I can't tell you how many finance committees, I often sit in on finance committee and board meetings in my advising of schools. And we had these long conversations about, is this the right moment to use a reserve? Now, whether it was the right moment or not for a particular school, my point to many schools is like, this is the thing you have reserves for, right? It is a global pandemic that is a systemic economic crisis for the entire planet. If that's not a moment to at least consider using your reserves, I'm not quite sure what is, right? That doesn't necessarily mean you should use them in a particular case, but it certainly should be on the table. So we all know that there are times in our professional lives where we have to dig down deep and do extra work and work more hours and work on weekends, right? But we also know that, like elite athletes, when an elite athlete runs out of energy from food and they don't have fat to burn, they can actually start burning muscle. And that's actually counterproductive longer term. And so I like this mental image of burning muscle instead of fat, because so many schools have become so lean that when I'm working with them, they just don't have the resources to draw upon for what's in front of them. And matching those resources, that capacity, to the challenge ahead is incredibly important. Okay. Balance and synergy, I mentioned this before, of on-campus, remote, and outsource. I know of a number of schools who are right now, for example, outsourcing. We went through a round of this maybe a decade ago, and people were outsourcing their bookstore and their dining services and other things. I'm working with several schools who have outsourced pieces of their business office function. In some cases, that has worked very well. In some cases, that has not worked very well. There is not a right answer or a wrong answer, just like there is not a right answer or a single wrong answer about who should be working remotely or on campus. I know of a school that has some long, nearing retirement key staff that they're using remote work as a phased retirement over the next couple of years. They're going to retain their institutional knowledge and their expertise, but they're going to use that transition as a way of freeing up some budget dollars and also beginning to make a transition so that when this really incredibly important person leaves, that, for example, that person who runs your accounts receivable, who knows every little thing about your school, that if they just leave, you'll lose a decade or 2 or 3 of institutional knowledge, right? There are opportunities there to be thinking about. Similarly, around outsourcing, one of the things our organization mission and data does is we have a wing of what we do with Kelsey Vroman, that we do institutional research for schools. We do dashboarding and other analysis because most schools have understood that they need to bring on an ability, a capacity within the school for this mission-driven, data-informed decision-making, whether it's for accreditation or just for good functioning. But they don't want to commit a full FTE or even half of an FTE to that person. And they don't want to just take a math teacher who has an extra course and put them in this as if they know what they're doing, right? That will be right for some schools and won't be right for others. Making those choices really intentionally so that you find those synergies is exactly what you should be aiming for. Similarly with consultants. Look, I am a consultant. I run a consulting practice. I will tell you, you should only hire a consultant if you really, really, really need us. Too many schools right now are turning to consultants as if we have a magic answer that we do not have. There is a bunch of stuff that different consultants in different fields have thought about more than your school may have the bandwidth or experience to do, right? Consultants and outsourcing are ways to extend your capacity. They're a way to extend your knowledge. They're a way to get some independent look at topics, right? But they are not a magic, we are not a magic elixir, right? You need to understand what the goal is as you and your school steward your resources well. And so getting this mix right is one of the biggest challenges going ahead. One of the other ones is that we as human beings have really, really, really short-term memory and inability to keep things and embed them into change. One of the great outcomes of the Great Recession was so many of our schools, everyone learned how important the admission process was, right? The Great Recession to me was the tipping point when faculty learned that they were part of the admission process and really bought into it. They understood that the health and the vitality of the school that they loved teaching at was dependent on them being part of the admission process. And for some schools, that stuck over the last decade. But over the last, especially 2 or 3 or 4 years, I've heard more and more of the conversations and faculty meetings that I heard before the recession. Why do we need to do open houses? Why do I need to talk to families? Do families really have to look inside my classroom during the academic day, even pre-COVID, right? And to me, that's a real loss for the school because we're losing the institutional memory that we gained during the recession of how important everyone being involved in the admission process was. There are many other examples similar to that. Striving toward financial sustainability. And if you see my other talks, I've talked about this a lot, so I'm going to not say a lot about this. You need to understand where you fall on this viability, stability, sustainability spectrum. If you are facing a budget deficit, there's a reasonably bounded universe of options if you don't have a money tree out back. And by that, I mostly mean a donor who will ad infinitum fill in whatever deficit you have forevermore. I actually don't know of almost any of those schools. You can get incrementally better through organizational effectiveness. You can pivot through organizational transformation. You can find a merger. You can either change through acquisition or by being acquired, or you can close. That's the universe. Now, of course, within here, there's a ton of different options, right? But this idea of really understanding, can we get to where we need to get to just by being a better version of ourselves? That is a modelable task. Or do we need a bigger change? Not do we want a bigger change, because that is a different question, right? Often schools start here, have to consider here before they'll even think about these. And I understand that. But I know some schools that have focused on this for 5 or 10 years when some analysis would have told them that this was never going to get them to where they needed to go to, for example, shrink a structural budget deficit. I mentioned the Enrollment Spectrum podcast, the first one in the series that will be dropping in a few weeks. One of the topics I talk about in there is this concept, which I love, called red oceans and blue oceans. If you don't know about red ocean and blue ocean strategy, I urge you to look it up. It's this fantastic, easy to understand concept. And it basically says, if you are competing in a dense market, you are almost destined to not win. It is almost impossible to win over the long run in a dense, saturated market. And the reason they call it a red ocean is that it is an ocean that is becoming bloody by the death of other organizations, right? And one of the interesting things about their research, and again, you can listen to the podcast to get some more detail, is you don't need to necessarily look far afield to find blue oceans. Their research suggests that actually you can carve out blue oceans within densely packed competitive red oceans. And I think this is a model for independent schools that is incredibly powerful. There is a path forward if you are in the middle of a city and you are surrounded by 18 competitors and some charter schools and some magnet schools and some good public schools. But you have to be thinking about it the right way, because research suggests if you're just trying to compete your way out of it, you're probably going to fail. The last part is about analysis. I love this quote from Ozan Varol from Thinking Like a Rocket Scientist. Test as you fly, fly as you test. And if I go all the way back to this idea of mission-driven, community-centered, data-informed decision-making, this is where we can use tools like scenario planning, visualization, sensitivity analysis, simulations, stress tests, tabletop exercises, etc., to give us better data so that when we land our rover on Mars, good things happen, right? What NASA has been doing over the last number of years with the Mars expeditions, I think provide us incredibly good data points and models of things that we can do for our organizations as we look forward, about not just setting a direction and then blindly following it, but making course corrections as we get there, even when we are in flight. They were working on those rovers in transit, which is a really important lesson. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to ask you, Martha, how are we doing on time?
We are right at our deadline.
Perfect. So there is one question in. You're welcome to add other questions into that chat. And as I said, I will absolutely be happy to talk to anybody about any of these topics at 4 o'clock. Martha, am I right? That's the time?
Yes, 4 o'clock.
In the meantime, I very much look forward to seeing you all at the panel discussions and the other events that we have over the next couple of days. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you at the conference. I hope to join you in person in future years. And thank you for having me this morning.
Thank you so much, Ari. This topic of mission is one that's near and dear to my heart as a former advancement director myself, and as a former marketing person, a consumer marketing person. I had a genius boss who would say, you know, you're really just talking to yourself. So I think that idea of testing your model as you go on, make sure that there's actually a market for your model. You may be in love with it, but you have to make sure other people want it too. So with that, we're going to really try and stay on track today. Now we're going to have a little break so that you can get up and stretch your legs before you go to the first breakout session. So as you probably know, I hope you've had a chance to look at the schedule. We have 2 breakout sessions this morning and then a very brief closing session, and then we'll be together tomorrow afternoon starting at 1. Andrea, are you there? Do you want to tell people how they're going to access the sessions, just to kind of remind them?
Sure. So everyone should have access now to our website, the special conference access page on the website. That's where you're living for the next 2 days. You'll get all the buttons and access points right there. You don't need to go anywhere else. Just hang out there and you should be good to go.
Okay, so we're going to end this session, and you'll have a choice of 3 breakout sessions starting at 9:30. And if you have questions, you can certainly email me or Andrea, but you may not get an immediate response. We are trying to monitor email, but it gets a little overwhelming when we're in the middle of Zoom. So just be patient with us. We're here, and we will see you shortly.
Thank you all.